Hello and welcome to How the World Works. If this is your first time listening, welcome. And if you're back, thanks for coming with us again. This show is about money, power, politics and history, but always through a very simple lens, how big decisions made far away end up shaping ordinary lives. Today's topic is one that gets talked about a lot, and often badly. The idea that young people feel the system is rigged, not unlucky, not impatient, rigged. Now, this episode is not about conspiracy. It's not about shadowy rooms or secret plans. It's about incentives, trade-offs, and unintended consequences, most of them quite public and well documented. Let's start with something important. Every generation complains about fairness. That's not new, but historically most generations still experienced rising living standards over time. That's what made the complaints manageable. What's different today is that for many younger people, that upward trend has stalled or reversed. And that's not opinion, it's measurable. In the UK, real wages, adjusted for inflation, have seen very weak growth since around 2008. According to the Office for National Statistics and the Resolution Foundation, median real pay today is only marginally higher than it was before the global financial crisis. For younger workers, earnings growth has been particularly weak compared to previous generations at the same age. So when people say it feels harder to get ahead, that feeling is grounded in reality. Housing is where this becomes impossible to ignore. In the 1990s, average house prices were roughly 3 to 4 times average earnings. Today, they're closer to 9 times earnings, and significantly higher in parts of the country where jobs are concentrated. That shift didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't the result of one policy. It was the cumulative effect of planning constraints, population growth, low interest rates, and policies designed to stabilize the financial system. The result is simple. Housing costs rose much faster than incomes, and younger people arrived later to a market that had already repriced itself. Again, no conspiracy required, just compounding effects. Now we need to talk about COVID, because it matters. The pandemic wasn't just a health crisis, it was a massive economic shock. Governments quite rightly stepped in to prevent collapse. Furlough schemes, business support, emergency spending on a scale not seen in peacetime. To fund this, states borrowed heavily, and central banks kept interest rates very low. That prevented a depression, but it also had side effects. Asset prices, particularly housing and equities, rose sharply during and after COVID. Meanwhile, younger workers were more likely to be in insecure jobs, more likely to lose income, and more likely to have their early careers disrupted. Graduates entered one of the most unsettled labour markets in decades, so the recovery was uneven. Stability was preserved, but not distributed equally. This brings us to an important distinction. This isn't about who works harder. It's about the difference between owning assets and earning income. Over the past 15 years, policy has repeatedly prioritized stability in asset markets. That makes sense from a system perspective. Pensions depend on asset values. Banks depend on collateral. Governments depend on confidence. But the side effect is that asset owners benefited disproportionately, while those relying mainly on wages did not. That's not ideology. It's how the system transmits policy. Younger people also tend to start adult life with higher student debt, higher rents, and later access to home ownership. In England, average student loan balances now exceed £45,000. At the same time, home ownership among under 35s has fallen sharply since the 1990s, and renting has become a long-term condition rather than a transitional phase. That changes life patterns. Later families, lower savings, and much less margin for error. Not because people are reckless, but because the buffer is thinner. You'll often hear this framed as people today just spending differently. And yes, consumption patterns do change. But cheaper electronics don't offset the costs that determine real stability. Housing, childcare, energy, transport, those are the costs that have risen fastest. So why does this feel like the system? Because when outcomes repeat across millions of people, it stops feeling personal. It starts feeling structural. That doesn't mean malicious. It means the system is optimized for something else. Stability, crisis prevention, and risk containment, all sensible goals. But over time, trade-offs accumulate, and younger generations are experiencing the downside of those trade-offs simultaneously. Periods like this aren't new. They tend to follow major shocks, wars, financial crises, pandemics. COVID fits that pattern. History shows that systems do eventually adjust, but usually slowly and sometimes reluctantly. The tension we're seeing now is part of that adjustment process. So when young people say the system feels rigged, they're not saying someone planned it this way. They're saying their lived experience doesn't match the promises they were given. And when that gap persists, trust erodes, quietly at first. That's not a moral judgment, it's a social signal, one worth paying attention to. If you found this episode useful, consider subscribing or sharing it. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Thanks for listening to How the World Works.